this year I've kind of thought about that we needed to, I'd like to learn about people's ancestors. You know, they're more than just names and dates, but what about it? What were they like? What did they do? Where did they live? You know, all of that kind of stuff. I have an ancestor, David Russell, who's my fourth great grandfather, and I was just curious about him. Hey, well, I'll think more about that. But another thing I wanted to do, I had never done a PowerPoint ever. So I decided, well, I would learn to do a PowerPoint. And y'all can critique it. Danny says it's okay for the first one. But we'll see. We'll see if we can get it to work and all of that. So we'll see. Another thing, I said I'm going to break a cardinal rule of teaching about anything is that I'm going to tell you everything I know about it, which is not much. So you're not supposed to teach to the limit of your knowledge. You're always supposed to know a little bit more. That's not going to happen here. I brought some books that you might, you know, if you want to know more, don't take my books, but some ideas of books that are available and that I have used, and I wish I knew everything in those books, but I don't. The other thing is it's going to be kind of rambling. Yeah, I asked Floyd, I said, he said he was going to come. I said, now, are you going to be embarrassed when I'm just up there rambling around? And he said, you ramble all the time anyway. So I'm going to ramble. Danny added these cool page tags. But this is a little bit about my Russell family. Started out in Scotland and ended up in Tennessee. And
Nancy,
sorry.
are you still?
I
Okay.
did it, didn't I?
And speak into the microphone. That'll help.
All right. Can you hear it?
Yep.
That sounded okay. David Russell, like I said, is my fourth great grandfather. My mother's mother was her maiden name was Russell, and her father was an Andrew Russell. I never knew him, but I knew his wife, and you know, of course, her married name was Russell. But then Andrew's father was a David Grant Russell. He bought land in Madison County, and even my grandmother, my mother lived there. I knew that house, you know, we visited all the time. So that if you happen to know Russell Road in Jackson, all of that land was there. So I was just always kind of interested in that Russell family. My great grandfather's nephew had a pretty well-known genealogist in Tennessee research the family for him, and I was lucky enough to get copies of her papers. And she only went back to this David Russell, and she gave up. And she pretty much said she gives up. There are too many Russells, and they're too tangled up back then, and she couldn't figure it out. And I thought, I got ancestry, I've got all of this, I can figure it out. Well, no. But I did think with the technology that I could do more. Just to kind of a picture of the British Isles, Scotland, of course, to the north, England to the south, Ireland off to the left. The closest point between Northern Ireland, that's almost round-shaped thing, and the sticking out part of Scotland is only 12 miles. So the going back and forth between Northern Ireland and Scotland is not unusual. All of it's not that close, but the nearness of all those countries, those three countries, it just makes it's kind of like our states. You were talking about nearby states. It's not like it was any great distance from Scotland to Northern Ireland. So Ulster is a name for part of Northern Ireland, really not the whole thing. Y'all know Queen Elizabeth I had no children, and so her rival, Mary Queen of Scots, she executed her, but Mary's son, her son James became James VI of Scotland, but when Queen Elizabeth died, he became James I of England. And so he was king of both countries, both Scotland and England. And there had always been this contentiousness between England and Ireland. And so, they got rid of the native Irish in Ulster, in Northern Ireland, and they thought that to keep the problems down with those Irish, they would move these troublesome Scots over to Ireland, and that would solve two problems at once. It would crowd out the Irish and it would get rid of the Scots. Even though James was Scottish himself, the Scots had a reputation for being kind of a problem. So that he offered the opportunities to settlers from southern Scotland. These were not Highlanders. These were from southern Scotland and northern England. He'd be glad to get rid of them because they didn't get along very well with each other. They'd raid back and forth and sell cattle. The Scots might sell the cattle to the Englishmen, and the next week they go steal them back. So there was just a lot of raiding back and forth. So James gave, he settled land with the wealthy Scots, and they might have been absentee landlords, but then they could move for more opportunities. They could move these southern Scots and the northern English, but mostly from Scotland, into Ulster, into Northern Ireland. The majority of these people were at least Protestant and mostly Presbyterian. And again, James and everybody's just glad to get rid of them. Just move over there and we won't have to deal with them anymore. So then they were there for a length of time. They, when it first started, excuse me, we were talking Shakespeare's time. And so as time went on, there were all kinds of complicated, I didn't understand all that, complicated conflicts between Ireland and England, and sometimes Scotland was in on it. A lot of it was religious, some of it was economic. They just back and forth arguing about everything. There were a lot of droughts and cold weather that ruined crops in Northern Ireland. Rack rents, I've heard of rack rents, but it's just unreasonably high rents that were impossible for these settlers to pay. And there was a lot of religious discrimination. Only the pastors of the Church of Ireland, which was big comparable to the Church of England, said they were Episcopal, Anglican. Only those pastors could perform marriages, for instance. And if you didn't want to get married in the church, if you were Presbyterian or other Protestant for that matter, if you didn't want to get married in the Church of Ireland, you were not legally married, and therefore your children were illegitimate, and that didn't go over well. And then there were all kinds of trade prohibitions and restrictions, and eventually the people in Northern Ireland, the Scots Irish, got fed up with it and said, we're out of here, we're going to the colonies. One thing that this was really new to me, flax. Any of y'all seen flax? I've never seen it growing. I know that you take flax to make linen, and we've heard of linen tablecloths and all of that. But when the Scots moved into Ireland, the farmers there did grow a certain amount of flax to make their clothes. That was essentially what clothes were made out of. flax into linen or wool. But those two things, cotton was not, they just didn't have cotton clothing. And these people couldn't afford silks and satins, things like that. So the flax was important. But the native Irish were not really good at doing it, but the Scots were good at making, taking the flax and making linen. So when they moved there and started making their linen, it was so well done that it became about 25% of Ireland, the whole thing, Ireland's exports, and it was about 10% of their total economy was the Scots linen. Well, the flax seed grew well in the colonies, and so they would ship the seed to Ireland, to Northern Ireland. The farmers would grow the seed into flax and process it, and then send the processed linen to the colonies. So the more the colonies grew, the more demand there was for Scots-Irish linen. And the English eventually said, you're ruining our linen trade. Their linen is not as good. So they started regulating it to protect the English linen. That was something else that just didn't, you can imagine, didn't go over well. I just thought these pictures of flax, pretty blue flowers, looks kind of like chicory, if you've seen it. And then it dies back, it looks a lot like soybeans or something to me, with the kind of dead looking stuff. I don't know, I can't imagine who ever thought that if you took that grassy looking stuff and beat it, that you could end up with a pile of hair looking stuff. And they'd use the combs, you've seen cotton combs, they'd use that and make it into straight, straighten it out like that through those combs, and then it could be woven. It does look like hair, and that's where the term flaxen hair, people that are blonde, that's where that came from, because it looks like a pile of flax. You've seen the spinning wheels that are small, those are actually flax wheels. I think you could spin wool on that also. The great big spinning wheels are more for cotton, but the little ones that are pretty common are actually flax wheels. So they went to the colonies. The Scots-Irish who had had enough of Ulster and were brave enough to move to the colonies first went to New England because there was supposedly freedom of religion there. They found out pretty quickly that they were not welcome, that the Puritans and so forth there, when they said freedom of religion, they meant freedom to worship the way we worship, but we don't really mean freedom of religion. So then they gave up on New England and they started pouring into Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. They went there because they didn't want to go to Maryland, just a little bit south, because that was a Catholic colony, and they didn't, Presbyterians didn't want to go there. They didn't want to go a little bit farther south to Virginia because of the Church of England, and they didn't want to have anything to do with the English or the Church of England. So Philadelphia welcomed the Quakers, other Protestants, the Presbyterians. Yeah, they were very diverse and a very welcoming. So that worked well for them. They moved. You can see Philadelphia way over here on the right, and they apparently poured into Philadelphia by the thousands. Then they moved land, always land, farther west to Lancaster County and York, and of course those counties weren't really those counties at that time. That's a modern map. But they moved across the bottom pretty much of Pennsylvania. I'm sure some went north, but the majority stayed right along that southern edge of Pennsylvania. I know you can't read this, but it's the will of John Russell from Franklin County, Pennsylvania. I think he's my David Russell's father. This John does have a son, David. The dates work out. So maybe, I need more proof, but maybe he's maybe he's his father. But what I really want you to see was in the will, he says, I give to my dear wife all the yarn, flax, wool that's now in the house. So, it's going to show you there that the flax was so important. That's something I never knew. This manner of mask, sometimes it's spelled M-A-S-Q-U-E, sometimes with the K. And it was, William Penn was given thousands of acres of Pennsylvania. Well, he didn't settle it or do anything with it immediately. The Scots-Irish were moving across the bottom of Pennsylvania, including this area that was set aside for William Penn that he called the Manor of Mask. I think it was named after something back in England that he was familiar with. Well, he got land from the Indians in 1736. Scots-Irish moved in, but it was several years later before Penn decided that he was going to sell that land, settle it, Well, the Scots-Irish were here, and when Penn sent his agents in to say, oh, so sorry, you're going to have to get out, and they said, just try and make us. And they threatened the agents. Apparently, some of them said, one man doesn't need to own that much land anyway, we're not moving. And the agents were scared to push it. They were, so they stayed there. Eventually, they worked out a compromise that anybody who was already there by 1740 could buy the land at a reasonable price. So this John Russell was there. He was there, and strangely, I have at least one other line, a Ramsey line. He was there, and then some others that I think probably were lines. But this Manor of Mask I've never heard of, but I can just picture him saying, just try and make us move, we're not going anywhere. We finally got the land that we want. The Great Wagon Road, sometimes called the Philadelphia Road. You can see it starts Philadelphia up here. Look first at it going across the bottom of Pennsylvania. Have any of you been to the Natchez Trace? Okay, you know those sections of the Natchez Trace that don't look like a modern highway, but you can get off a little bit and drive through the old part. That's what the Great Wagon Road looked like. You can tell that it was can't think of the word I want. But the roadbed is lower because it's had so much traffic on it. It's just mashed it down. There's a better word than that. They went across the bottom, avoiding Maryland, but they went across the bottom and came down on the western edge of Virginia. The first part of it really was, it was pretty great, and it was for wagons. They invented these Conestoga wagons, which are actually similar to but different than the prairie schooners that were used later. These were very narrow, and see how they tilt up on either end, because the trail was so rough, up and down. If it didn't tilt up, you would lose your load. And they were pulled. This area, this section of the Conestoga wagon was used on the Pennsylvania part, and they were like our semi-trucks. They carried all kinds of merchandise back and forth across the Pennsylvania part. And so they were, that part of the road was decent compared to what it turned into later. One thing that I read about these Conestoga wagons, that there was so much traffic on it. They drive on the left in England, So the question is, why do we drive on the road? And this article is saying it's because of the Philadelphia wagon road and the Conestoga wagons, that a lot of times the driver would walk beside the wagon and he'd want his horses on the outside so he could walk on the better part of the road. And he'd walk on the left and have the horses on the right of him. And so, you know, if they were meeting, then the drivers would, I guess, go around each other, but the wagons could stay on the outer edge. So it was kind of like the way we drive, and it's based on the horses and this wagon road, which I thought that was pretty neat. Just another thing too about the Conestoga horses, they were similar to probably what we're used to with the Clydesdales. They were work horses, not riding horses, but work horses. I've read that some of them were as high as 17 hands, which would be almost 6 feet high it'd be almost my head height at the shoulders, not the heads, but at the shoulders. So big draft horses to pull these big wagons. And it's cool because our ancestors would have seen those things. You know, if there were Scots Irish, they probably had those wagons, they saw them, they rode in them, walked beside them, whatever. And then they go across the bottom of Pennsylvania, come down through the valley of Virginia, which is also known as the Shenandoah Valley. Beautiful. Any of you been in that area with, especially, first of all, with Stanton? The mountains are on either side, and so of course it was easier to travel down the valley part of it. Some settled, some kept going. Beautiful, beautiful land through there. You can see why they loved it. That even though they were in Virginia, the Virginians didn't mind that, you know, most of them were Church of England that settled in eastern Virginia, but they didn't care if those troublesome Scots Irish went to the west, across the mountains, let them go back there and let the Indians attack them, and they'll leave us alone over here on the east. So they were, they just used them as a buffer against the Indians, and left them alone, pretty much. More of the Great Wagon Road, the kind of in the middle of that, it looks like Staunton, it's pronounced Stanton. That's in Augusta County. It's still Augusta County, but at one time Augusta County was all of Western Virginia, all of Kentucky. It was just everything to the west of that area. And around Stanton, William Beverly, William Borden were given, again, huge tracts of land. They had to, in order to keep that land, they had to settle settlers on that land. And so there was a push to make the land prices, I'm sure, good and to get the settlers there. My David Russell, I'm not quite sure what, except maybe land, it prompted him to move apparently from Pennsylvania, but I know he had land in the Borden tract. I've got deeds that show where he bought and sold land. And so I know he came down, and he would have come down that Great Wagon Road into Stanton, and then the Borden tract, the Beverly tract on top, and the Borden tract farther to the south. Timber Ridge Church is a Presbyterian church. It was first a log church, and then 1793. Now David was gone by then, so he would have known the log church that was there. When we were in the area, this is very typical of the stone, pretty simple, not real big, stone Presbyterian churches that were built. I thought at first he went to Timber Ridge. I think there was a sister church to that called New Providence, and I'm actually leaning toward thinking that he went to New Providence, but it would look very similar to Timber Ridge. And like I said, they were sister churches, and at the log stage, they were built about the same time. So it's still Presbyterian. more Great Wagon Road in Philadelphia and down through the Valley of Virginia. But you can see down through Roanoke, but you can see where part of the road, multiple roads actually, it was not really one road. Some people went on down into North Carolina, but we're interested in the road that went to Knoxville at the end there. Knoxville was there early, but wasn't the first city. Jonesboro, that's up just a little bit, was actually the first town in Tennessee. And David lived around Jonesboro. Again, I've got deeds that he was there. Washington County. We'd say Washington County, Tennessee now. It was Washington County, North Carolina most of the time. And it included Tennessee all the way to the Mississippi River. And they probably wouldn't mind claiming further than that. Just whatever was Tennessee lands at the time was Washington County. So some of the deeds I have for David are Washington County. His will was actually probated in Washington County, but he lived in Greene County. That's the best map I could find that made you read the thing on that. But Greene County was formed in 1785. David was on the first jury in Greene County when it was formed. Apparently, they didn't have any business to conduct, so they didn't really do anything. But he was legally on the jury. And actually, after 1785, he was a justice of the peace in Greene County. I bought a couple books. Incidentally, I have books up here. I might have said that. But I got the minute books for the Court of Common Pleas that he was a justice of the peace. Apparently back then, justice of the peace that was a real job. They really did hold court. They did civil things. They did probate. They did deeds. They did debts between people up to a certain amount. So they really did, unlike justice of the peace today, that I think it's basically an honorary title. They really did work. The smaller book there has his name in it over 100 times. Didn't tell me a whole lot, but he's there. So he was, they were the Honorable Worshipful David Russell was there for court any number of times. He was in 1792, and all of this is pre-statehood. He was one of the elders of the Presbyterian Church in Greene County that bought land for an early church called Mount Bethel. That Mount Bethel church has gone through a lot of joining and separating, and frankly, I don't understand all of their coming, new side and old side and all of that. But Mount Bethel Presbyterian Church does have quite a few graves there now, and they apparently have hundreds of unmarked graves. So my theory is that he's probably buried there. I know that some of the other elders that bought that land for the church are buried there, and they're marked. So it just kind of makes sense to me that that's probably where he's buried. And that's something I'll never know. Maybe if I can get the girl that worked on the Clark Cemetery and give her a name, then she might be able to douse out a grave for him. The other thing about Greene County, when he was in Greene County, my point here is the fan research, the friends and associates and neighbors. If you can't find things about the person you're looking for, look for somebody else that's close to them, and maybe you'll get some hints. I got some marvelous information about David by just following up. One of the things that were in the book about 1806, I think it was, said that he gave one of his sons a power of attorney to go back to Pennsylvania because of the estate of a Robert Young and to get what was coming to him. That's a name I had never heard of. There are no Youngs that I know of in the family. It was just and I thought, why would he do that? So I started researching Robert Young, found his will on Ancestry, and this Robert Young apparently had no children. He left most of his estate to his sister's two daughters, Jane, and he called them Jane McNutt and Mary McNutt. Well, I knew that David married Jane McNutt. I've had some go around your elbow and come back to it and figure out that that's correct. But I know that her sister was named Mary. All of that fit. He left the land, well, not land so much as money, to his sister's children, these two girls. He didn't even know if they were still alive. He said if they're not, then he'd leave it to somebody else. But David sent his son to Pennsylvania, and then we've got the documentation that the son who went, I can't remember which one of them went, but anyway, there's documentation there. They had to prove that David was married to Jane McNutt. And so in there it says proof of marriage. So, I've got that with this strange thing of following up on who is Robert Young. So if you've got a strange thing, follow up on it. You really might look at that was a piece of information. And it also has gotten me back another generation on that McNutt line. I knew her first name from the will. I'm assuming that the mother was Mary Young, who married the Anthony McNutt. So anyway, if you've got little clues, little strange things, and you think, well, what is that? Follow up on it. You might just look up on it. One of the last thing I want to show you that fascinated me was the steps that Tennessee went through to become a state. In about 1772, a lot of settlers came down from Virginia thinking they were still in Virginia when they came down into eastern Tennessee, which is what it's called in, but anyway, to that area. They thought they were in Virginia. There were people from North Carolina who came across the mountains because they were fed up with the politics and so forth in North Carolina. So they came thinking they were going to Virginia. So essentially, nobody cared about that land, not Virginia, not North Carolina. So the settlers there formed the Watauga Association. And it, for about 4 years, it existed. They didn't legislate anything. They used Virginia laws because at that time they thought they were in Virginia. And all they did was defend themselves from the Indians and deal with theft or just somebody stole my horse, that kind of local things. They didn't try to make laws, and they were not trying to be independent. They just wanted some government in that area. Well, about 1776, North Carolina, with the Revolution, they declared their independence, from Great Britain, and so the British Church of England, all of that, that was gone. So the Watauga Association petitioned North Carolina to take them in. They had figured out by then they were not in Virginia, they were in North Carolina. So North Carolina did, and it became first the Washington District, and then very soon became the Washington County. Same thing, but just changed the name a bit. About 1783, there was what they called the Great Land Grab. The ones in North Carolina who knew what was fixing to happen, they managed to get their land ownership in the Tennessee lands. I mean, they got lots and lots of land titles, all of that. And then they immediately, the next year, ceded the Tennessee lands to the federal government. They needed to, that was what they could do to pay off their debts for their part of the revolution. So they said, okay, we'll give you this and you can sell that land and they'll take the place of our debts. But they quit very quickly. They did that in June and they very quickly repealed it. They said, just kidding, you know, we're not giving it to you after all. So by August, again, these people have no government. There's nobody. North Carolina doesn't really care. They don't get, so they've got to have some government, or it's just literally wild. So they formed the state of Franklin. They have a governor who works. They're trying to get. They even got Ben Franklin. They named it. It started out as Frank Land. And then they changed it a bit to Franklin, so it would be Ben Franklin's name to try to get him to support it. And his letter says, well, I just really don't know enough about what's going on to have an opinion. Good luck. But it was the state of Franklin. And you can find some documents, some deeds and all that will say, you know, state of Franklin. But it was never legally recognized. So then North Carolina ceded the land to the federal government again. And this time it stuck. The federal government named this Tennessee area the territory south of the River Ohio. Strangely enough, it skipped Kentucky. So it was Tennessee, and I guess they were planning on adding land south of Tennessee. But I looked up in the 1790 census that you all know is not available for Tennessee because it wasn't state. But I have, David is in the 1790 census for the territory south of the River Ohio. And I found it in the Ohio census, but it very clearly says Greene County and territory south of the River Ohio. So that it was the indexing of it that was a little wacky. So if you're looking for somebody back then, it would be worth looking in Ohio to see what you might find. Blunt was the governor of the territory south of the River Ohio. They had to have a certain number of people. Then when they got to the stage of, I think it was 5,000, they could have a House of Representatives. David Russell was one of about 10 that was nominated for a House of Representatives. George Washington picked the, I think, 5 that he wanted. That included John Sevier and some other names that you know. So David didn't make it, but he was at least nominated. Then you had to have 60,000 people to become state. And Blunt, I guess, he was, I have found he was quite a character, but he was smart enough to, when he had the sheriffs of the counties in East Tennessee to take the census, they needed 60,000 people. He tied their salary to how many people they put on their census. So amazingly enough, they had 77,000. So the sheriffs made sure that they got paid, but Tennessee became a state. Well, Kentucky had become a state through Virginia lands, but Tennessee was the first federal lands state to become a state, and there was no procedure. So basically, the representatives from Tennessee went to Washington and said, "We are your new state," and they said, "Okay." So all these steps that we went through to become a state, I don't know, it's just back and forth, and I had no idea. I knew that Tennessee became a state in '96, but I just didn't know, all of that, the rest of that. A modern map of Tennessee. I put this in just kind of to show you more of the Russell family thing. Greene County is up here where David was. His son Andrew, that's my third great grandfather, moved down to Bradley County. He was there for land about the time that they ran the Cherokees out and Amber was in. Then the next one, my second great-grandfather, ended up in Madison County. He was a train conductor, not the engineer. He didn't drive it, but he was on the train doing whatever conductors do. And he ended up in Madison County because that was one of the terminal points for the train. But he did that during the Civil War. And the Russell family there has been in Madison County with close by ever since. It just shows you the typical Scots-Irish of going from Scotland to Northern Ireland, to the colonies, to the States, being an important part of the settlement of whatever the West was at the time, and then always land and always moving west. It was very, very typical, probably, of a lot of things. The Presbyterian part of it, I'm still Presbyterian, so that's stuck. But I'm going to show you one other thing that I told you I was going to do, that I've found to be very helpful. And again, you can't see this, but I decided to do a timeline for David Russell, put it on the computer, and everything that I knew about him, I tried to put it in chronological order. And because it's on the computer, then as I've learned more, I can go back and put it in. If I find out he did a deed in bought land, sold land, I can go back and put it in. I tell him he's writing on this, I've got some money to update. That's really made a difference to me of sorting out his life of, he bought and sold land a lot, and where his children were born, the time period that I think his first wife must have died. Just the timeline has helped a lot. So to me, that's been a good thing. So, that's all I have to say. I don't know. I can imagine. Don't ask me any hard questions. Yeah.
Just a comment. Supposedly the first settlers in Tennessee were in 1769. And so
Maine
from,
and George Russell.
Yeah,
Was
it's
made to Lydia Bain. I have not yet figured out the connection. I feel like there is a connection between George and David, but I don't know what that is. David had a son named George.
but in that short time period between 69 and 96, that many people came into Tennessee. That is just
I just poured it.
It's
Now, I don't think there were
astounding.
probably as many as the 77,000 that they found
Yeah.
at that time, but, yeah, those lands, it's always land, they say follow the land, and that works, the deeds. Incidentally, a deed is how I made a positive connection between the David Russell in Greene County and the David Russell of the Borden tract, because in Greene County, he did a deposition to say that, yes, he had sold land in the Borden tract where he used to live in such and such a year, and I had the deed where he had sold it, but he was, I don't know if they lost it, I don't know what the deal was, but he had to do a deposition to say that he and his first wife, Margaret, had sold that land. So that document was a positive proof to me that David Russell and this David Russell were the same person. I don't know, I think that's why I love the genealogy. It's following so many little trails of things.